We welcome to the show. Our special guest is Lawrence Krauss. Lawrence is a theoretical physicist, professor, teacher, cosmologist, and author. I truly feel that Lawrence probably should come with a disclaimer, and that is a good thing. His works, his writing works, long lists, excuse me if I miss some of them to be brief. We have Fear of Physics, Atom, Quantum Man, The Physics of Star Trek, Beyond Star Trek, A Universe from Nothing, and the newest book, The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far, Why Are We Here? We welcome Lawrence Krauss.
It's great to be here in this interesting place.
Excellent. Yeah, so for everyone listening, we are in a military bunker disguised as a health club in Sydney, Australia. And as we're walking down the stairs, this is probably becoming very commonplace. Even in this scenario, people are pointing you out.
It's a privilege.
Yeah.
It's surprising, but it's a privilege. I'm getting used to it.
And this specific trip, if everyone just would look, it says you're here for the Sydney's Writers Festival.
That's one of the reasons I was here, yeah, Sydney Writers Festival. I also had a speaking tour, and I did one of my favorite Australian shows called Q&A.
We saw you on it, and I wanted we might as well start there. I wanted to talk about this specific time on Q&A. When I first started, really getting into you, I think it was 2013. The Q&A that went, I don't want to say viral, but when you were pretty much matched up there with, Christian label, people really standing behind their label sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it was the first time that I was able to see somebody that it was like you were meant for that scenario. You were like giving people a voice who have been told to believe a certain way for so long. Is that something that was part of your intent with that whole thing, or did it just kind of manifest around you?
Well, you never know what you're going to get into in anything, including in this interview. And so I went into it prepared to talk about and to deal with anything. But I think one of my goals when I'm on a TV program like that, or in general, is to get people thinking. Is to get people thinking about things that they hadn't thought about before and confronting myths and superstitions they may have had. And it's rare to be, and therefore important, it's rare to have the opportunity on national TV to confront myths that are taken seriously by most people in society. And I feel very strongly that I know that there are lots of people that write me before those shows saying, look, there are important issues that are not being covered. There are chaplains going into our public schools brainwashing kids. And so I do feel like I have the opportunity to speak on behalf of all those people, and I take that responsibility seriously.
We definitely appreciate it. It's almost, I don't want to say a duty, but it's very good to hear, and as somebody as established and evolved as yourself, as both a man and a scholar, to understand that and not just be so, because the industry that one of the hats I wear, the fitness and wellness space, a lot of times the people, the experts, the PhDs in exercise science, they kind of just shy away from that. And what happens is the industry becomes a little colluded with pseudo experts, and it's actually a big problem in the industry.
Yeah, I think I can understand that, and well, it's difficult because you get a lot of hate mail and all the rest. But I think it's important, as Spider-Man said, with great power comes great responsibility. But I have the opportunity to have a big soapbox, and therefore I think it's important to use that when I can, and it. And I also see, the point is I have a lot of hats, and I'm a scientist, and I have credibility in that regard. So I have nothing, I don't have to worry. I have nothing to lose. I can say what I want. And there are lots of people, by the way, who write me every day and say, shut up, just talk about science. And they don't realize that science and the rest of society are intermingled in an important way. As I talked about just recently at the festival, science and culture are tied together. And we need the tools of science in politics and in the public arena. We need empirical evidence and testing. All those things are necessary to make democracy work, and so we have to talk about that.
It was almost like the whole thing about having a voice. I was 7 years old in the second grade, raised Roman Catholic at all boys Catholic school, Northeast Ohio, and they're telling us we're getting ready to do our first communion. I'll never forget this. Sister Luann, she's telling us that. Oh no, it was our first confession, and she's telling us that we have to tell Father DeMarinis our sins. And I tell her, I'm like, now granted, disclaimer, I don't believe any of that right now.
Yeah.
And at 7, I realized.
Yeah.
And I get suspended for it because I questioned the system.
Really?
100%. And this went on my whole, up until I was old enough to realize I wasn't a bad person.
Yeah.
But that system, I was living my life 7, 8, 9, 10, thinking I was a bad kid.
Yeah, you're a bad kid. And I get so many people write me every day. And one of the reasons I made that movie, The Unbelievers, is I get people who say, I've seen that movie. And I realize, first of all, I'm not alone. And secondly, I'm not a bad person. People talk about religion, how, it can do good things and bad things, but they don't realize that even the innocuous kind of religion has this impact on kids and adults all around the world who are alone and feel they're bad people for just asking questions. And we should encourage everyone to ask questions. And so this idea is that you can't question God or the existence of God, and if you do, you're a bad person, is horrible. And so I think it's really important for people like me to point out on public TV that it's fine. There's no problem with it. It's easy to do, and it's not such a bad thing.
And the awesome thing about it is I found you while I moved to Australia, and Americans listening at home who maybe haven't been to Australia yet, it's not the most, in some spot, it's pocketed. It's not the most open-minded place, especially network TV on a public Q&A segment. And I was going to ask you, do you ever have the intent of wanting your own space just to do that regularly?
Well,
I know you're a busy guy.
Well, that's the point. I think, a lot of people say, why do you have a podcast? Why do you do this? I mean, my point is I've got a lot of day jobs, and I'm a professor. I run an institute, but I have lots of opportunities to speak out, and I think I'd rather do that than make it my living, if you wish. And I think continuing to do science gives me additional credibility as well. And so I just like to do a lot of different things, and I plant seeds, and you never know where they come. And we've talked about I do film some TV series, and I do films, but we've talked about creating some more series on some of my books, and we'll see how that goes.
For a gentleman who is so, in my opinion, it's like a movement to challenge people, to challenge what they've been told, to criticize the evidence or the lack thereof, so they can think freely. Of the titles you have, of all of those hats you wear, which one do you wear the most? Which one sticks to you closest?
I don't like titles, first of all. Yeah. So I don't. I mean, scientist, if I was going to label one in some sense, because I think we're all scientists, but that's a title I guess I'm proudest of. But I think that permeates everything that I do in principle if I'm doing it right. Even my writing. I mean, I'm sure I'm an author and a writer, but even in that context, I'm talking about the process of science, and that's to me part of everything that I do, and including the fun I have with the awe and wonder, and fun I have doing adventures like this program.
Two American guys just sitting in a bomb shelter in Sydney, Australia.
Yeah, exactly. And I used to live in Ohio too, so there you go.
Yeah, Case Western.
Yeah, I was the chairman of the physics department.
Yeah,
Case Western.
There's a branch in Rootstown, the Neo UConn there.
Yeah.
Were you at that one?
No, I'm in
Cleveland.
Yeah, I'm in Cleveland. I was in Cleveland.
Yeah, I grew up in Youngstown.
Yeah, which is a tough place to grow up.
Very tough, man. And back to the writing style, because initially when I hear, people listening as well, they see the titles, and some of us, I feel, may get a little, we're not the most confident people collectively, so they might think, I won't be able to read a book Lawrence Krauss writes. But the thing you do super, super well is, maybe lack of better terms, you dumb it down so people like myself and my friends can understand it.
Well, I don't like the term dumbing down, but I try. Look, everything at some level is understandable if you're willing to think about it, and I think it's important to realize that people say, well, I don't get that science stuff, but they think you have to be a scientist to enjoy science, but they don't think you have to be a musician to enjoy Eric Clapton, or a painter to enjoy Picasso, or a writer to enjoy Shakespeare. I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to enjoy science, and so I try and take it from the point of view of how did I first begin to understand this, and talk about it that way, and it seems to work.
Yeah, that was the first thing I noticed when I opened, put a big dent in this one a while back, and then this one is just that it's kind of like a trick we trick ourselves to, like not getting started sort of thing.
Yeah.
When was that moment you had that you knew that you could stand on stage and be challenged and not be worried of how people viewed you, what their judgment was, and still have that moxie about you to deliver what you had inside?
Well, I think part of it is character. I've
always been there.
I think it's always been there, but I've tried to challenge myself to, when I could, to hone that ability. And I'll give you the clearest example. So when I was a kid, I worked at a science museum, and I gave a lot of lectures as a kid. And it was kind of like vaudeville in a way, because I do 10 shows a day. And what I did, because I knew the science, but also because it was important to me to challenge myself and others, is it could become very rote, and I don't like anything to be rote, because then it loses all the enthusiasm. So I remember I did an electricity show with electricity, magnetism, people's hair standing in it and all that. But my fun was then I would ask the audience, and there'd be hundreds of people there because there was a lot of tourists, to give me 5 words, and then I explained electricity during the show using those 5 words.
Wow.
And so, because it was improv, but that's the kind of that was a good challenge to be able to think about things while you're talking about them, and not be afraid of confronting the unexpected.
What advice would you give the listener, people viewing this, that is maybe being hesitant in diving into what their real calling is? I think sometimes we don't listen to that. I was a victim of that for a long time. Just because you're so conditioned into thinking what dad told you to do or your mom told you to do, not realizing, hey, we're all different. They're just my parents. They just have me. They're not who I am.
Yeah.
So somebody out there may be stuck with finding themselves. What advice would you give them?
Well, first of all, the only advice I generally give is don't let the bastards get you down. but I think, look, do what you enjoy doing, because if you don't enjoy doing it, you're not going to be good at it. And you don't need an excuse to do it except to enjoy it. I think basically that's the fundamental idea. I like some of the things I do, I like to think have some purpose that's useful. But everything I do is because I'm motivated to do it. It some level pleases me, and therefore I think I do it well. So I think the bottom line is that people are too worried about jobs, and ultimately, if you're doing, it's not a job. If you do what you enjoy doing, it's not a job. And constantly. It's easy to get your validation from everyone else. The hardest thing is to learn how to get your validation from yourself, to try and ask yourself, am I doing what I want to do? Is this important? Am I pleased with what I did, even if other people aren't? And we all have problems doing that. But you constantly try. And it's like writing. You write. People ask me, how do you become a writer? Become a writer by learning how to write. By writing, by constantly writing, and the writing gets better the more you do it. And so everything you do it requires practice and forcing yourselves, because we are conditioned as social creatures to be not only influenced by others, but we're conditioned to want to believe things that may not be true.
All right, please tell me how wrong I am on this. This is just a theory of mine. So in your latest book, every chapter, I just opened up to chapter 5.
Yeah.
Every chapter begins, chapter 5 is Stitch in Time, and then there's a quote, he stretches out the north from the empty place and hangeth the earth upon nothing, Job chapter 26, verse 7. Now my theory was, man, how smart is Lawrence Krauss, not from what he writes or not from what he says, but did you see, because one of my hats is I consult for fitness owners, and one of the jobs is to find the white space in the market. So I was like, did Lawrence see he could use the attachment to ideologies, whether it's Christianity or Islam, and use physics and science as his vehicle to get his point across to the masses?
Well, yeah, in these 2 books in particular, I try and reach out to popular culture as a way, because one of the biggest things I tell teachers is, because I get asked about these things, is the biggest mistake any teacher makes is to assume their students are interested in what they have to say. Okay, but it's true for anyone. If you want to relate to people, you have to ask, where are they coming from? So with the physics of Star Trek, I use the fact that Star Trek is a big part of our popular culture. But religion is such a big part of our culture that I thought to try, well, there are 2 things. I thought, first of all, one has to confront it. Religion has usurped everything, not just morality, but fundamental existential questions for which it gives no answer. And so the question, why is there something rather than nothing, which is often viewed as a religious question, isn't a religious question, it's a scientific one, and we need to take it back. Similarly, why are we here is another question that too often religious people claim they have the answer to. And so I thought that by confronting these religious points of view and showing how science has changed our thinking and allows us to address them in ways that are so much more meaningful, that that'd be another way to touch base with people. And clearly, starting with the universe from nothing, it resonated. The fact that I was willing to confront this religious ideology and show that science could take us past it resonated for a lot of people.
So I have a couple messages. I'm not going to they're video messages from one of my buddies who lives in London, and he's one of those guys that so educated, he's just driven home the point that he's a Roman Catholic. And to condense it, what's the difference then of somebody saying like himself saying that science is religion? What would you say the easiest way to the difference between religion and science?
Well, science is not. I mean, people say that all the time.
Yeah.
Just science is just not just another religion, but it's not a religion at all. Religion is based on certain things not being subject to question, but in science, everything's subject to question. That's the first thing. Secondly, sure, scientists might have quote unquote faith in what they're doing, but the faith is eminently shakeable. You know, if I'm a scientist and I have a theory and I work hard on it, great. But the minute nature shows me it's not true, I throw it out like yesterday's newspaper. I don't cling to these notions just because I like them. I force my beliefs, if you want to use the word, and I like to say I don't.
Never use beliefs.
I know, but I was just going to say I never use the word beliefs. But I, to the extent that I anticipate things in advance and then test them, one could call it a belief. But the main thing is I force those beliefs to conform to the evidence of reality, not the other way around. And I think so. There's nothing, and not only by that, there's no hierarchy in science like there is in principle, like there is in religion. There's no one like the Pope whose views are not subject to question. Everyone, from the most eminent Nobel Prize-winning scientist, can be questioned and proved wrong by any student.
Do you think there is ever a possible way? Because also I hear a lot, without religion we would have never evolved to where we are as a society. What's your opinion on that?
Well, look, religion, it's true that science in some sense arose out of religion, but that's because religion was the only game in town at the time, before we knew how to understand the world. And, people say great scientists like Newton were religious, but sure he was. He was actually a little bit crazy, but as I talk about in the book. But it was because religion was like the National Science Foundation of the 16th century. You couldn't go to university. All the universities were religious. So there was no other opportunity to gain learning except through religion. But science grew out of religion, just like kids outgrow their parents. And it's great that kids outgrow their parents and go on and do new things. No good parent wants their kids to just stay in their shadow for the whole time. Science grew out of religion and then showed the religion was unnecessary.
Let's switch to energy. I'm a big fan of big crowds, and it's one of those things since I was a younger dude. Like I always just had a vision stepping on stage with thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
What was on a smaller micro scale? You did. I know it aired in 2013, but you were in Sydney and you were speaking not in front of a big crowd, but an intense crowd, and you were asked to do a debate with a group of Muslims.
Yeah, an Islamic group. Yeah.
And you were standing. Was there any hesitation? Was there any fear? Was there any, or did you just not look at them? You just looked at them as people and your message getting across. Did you not title them?
Well, that group wasn't. You never know in advance, but it was pretty clear they were a group that was.
Did they ask you to be there?
They asked me to be there, and they seemed like reasonable. I mean, earnest people, and they were. It was a pleasant experience. I've had another event in London which was less pleasant. With, a lot more women in bags and threats and the bodyguards and things. But here in Australia, that event was people earnestly wanted to have a discussion with me, and I was happy to have an earnest discussion with them. I was still fine in saying that these ideas were nonsense. That didn't bother me at all. And actually it was unfortunate because the young guy who they had me debate was again an earnest young guy, but not very experienced, and it was kind of easy for me to demolish him, and I felt a little bad for him, but it was pleasant enough, and I was pleased. The entire audience were Muslim. I mean, it wasn't advertised outside the Muslim community, as far as I could tell, which surprised me. But the fact that people came and listened, and that's great because preaching to the converted is fun. And there are times when I'm talking to thousands of people, audiences of 10 or 20,000 people. But and it's nice and it's very gratifying to your ego. But it's nice to be able to reach out into groups that you wouldn't normally get to hear these things and hope to plant some seeds.
So I'm going to paraphrase here, but there was something that just burned into my brain during that when you told them, you said that, I'm paraphrasing, I hope everybody in this room who has, with the deepest burning in your spirit, is faced one day somebody looking at you in the eyes telling you that you're wrong.
Well, actually, it was slightly different. What I said is I hope you discover some idea that's at the heart of your being is wrong. No one can tell you you're wrong in a way that you understand it. You have to discover yourself. But I hope everyone has something that they believe to be true in their heart that is proved that they find is wrong, because that's opens your mind. It opens you up to new ideas. It's part of what schooling is all about. Hopefully, that every student is confronted with some bias and prejudice they have initially, and discovers for themselves that it was just nonsense.
Yeah, it was very well put. And was this something that you say we need to be faced with realizing that we're not right. Basically, we need to understand that we're vulnerable and that there's room to learn and grow and change. How long did that mindset evolve with you? Like, were you the guy at 22 years old, however you were, in uni, debating, or were you sitting back and being quiet, or were you?
I was never quiet.
Yeah.
No, from the time I was a kid, I think I questioned things. That grew with time, partly by reading books by scientists that helped encourage me to have the courage to follow things and not trust what people might say. But yeah, I think it's again just a personality trait. I've never been worried about speaking out, and never been big on hierarchies. So I try not to have them. When I was the lower ranks of a hierarchy as a student or whatever, I didn't really care about it, and I tried not to. Now that I'm to some extent at the other end.
I've been recently getting into Feynman, and there's this quote that we all have things that stick to us, and it's the one he compares, I think, physics and sex.
Yeah. Physics and math. Yeah, physics is to math, as sex is to masturbation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things that you guys could Google this. When you type in Richard Feynman, it's one of his most popular ones. I wonder if he would have been around, if you would have asked him, "Hey, do you want this quote to defy your?"
Well, I knew Richard Feynman, and I wrote a book about him. But he was an example of someone I read early on that had a profound effect on me. He was a role model in ways, and I have him to thank for my attitude about a lot of things.
Were there any differences?
He was much better physicist than me.
How do you measure that?
Well, he was one of the best physicists of the 20th century. He was a remarkable human being. So I don't have expectations of being able to match his abilities in any way. And he's also a better bongo player apparently. But
Look at that. Did not know that.
Yeah. He was, and so anyway. But I don't. So we're all different. So I think. Well, I was going to say I'm a better writer, but Feynman didn't really. The books he wrote, which are wonderful to read, but they're not really books he wrote. He didn't like writing, and he didn't have the patience for it. And I think he put things down brilliantly. And The Character of Physical Law, which is a wonderful book, is great. But what it was is a transcript of his speeches. So he was a wonderful speaker and lecturer, and people transcribed that. And
through his words.
Yeah, so he didn't sit down and write and write books per se.
Yeah, Dali. There's a book. Got really in my mid-20s. Was really into Salvador Dali.
Yeah.
There's a book called Discovering Dali, of how he was one of these rare artists that while he was alive, he had a lot of attention. And then
He certainly did.
And he took a lot of credit for some of his students' work. But the question for you is, it's been written that Dali was able to, he was really into altered states of consciousness. Some said that he would fill these 2 buckets up of water, and he would be under a psychedelic, and then when one of them would drop, he would paint what he saw, and allegedly that's how he came up with his surrealism. Question, and then have you gotten to, like McKenna, his whole stoned ape theory with the whole food of the gods and the mushrooms coming from blood. What is your opinion on altered states of consciousness, and have you ever dived into that sort of realm?
Yeah, Feynman did, by the way, for a while, but I don't find it so interesting. I find the state of consciousness I have right now is fine, and I get and maybe it gets altered by learning new things about the universe. But since I don't know what consciousness is, I don't have the pretense of trying to explain what altered consciousness is or why it's better. So I just try and experience everything that I can experience. And some of those things alter the way I view the world, if you want to call that altered consciousness, fine. But I don't. While I've certainly taken drugs, I don't find it as something that illuminates the world anymore. To me, it just is. It just is sometimes relaxing.
Yeah, so not a necessity for a vehicle.
No, it's not a necessity. It's it's the same reason I drink alcohol from time to time. Same reason why I experience many things. It's part of being human. It's not all an intellectual journey.
So you mentioned something on Monday on the Q&A, and I know I'm really big on body language. When you started talking about it, you didn't really light up about it, but it had me super intrigued about the doomsday clock.
Oh yeah.
And I knew how serious it was with watching how you reacted to it, and I know my time's limited with you, so I wanted to talk about it. Could you share with the fans listening? Is that a once a year thing?
We now change it once. We now generally consider changing it once a year. It used to be once every 2 years. And every year we examine the world and see what the biggest existential threats are and decide whether the world is a more dangerous place, if you wish. And it's not a fun event. It's not a fun phenomenon, and it's not fun, particularly to unveil it, which I get to do as. I'm chairman of the board of sponsors of the bulletin, which was honorable for me because it was first ones were Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer, and so I'm honored to be in that position, and have that opportunity. But it's important because one day a year, and it just goes for one day in the sense that the news covers it for one day. One day, where there are thousands of papers around the world that confront at least the biggest existential questions facing humanity, and the rest of the year people ignore them. So, but hopefully we'll provoke people, and this is what we said in our message this year, which is that the leaders of the world aren't doing much of anything to make the world safer. Climate change or nuclear weapons. The only way they're going to act in the right direction is if the public demands it. So the public has to have an active voice.
So are you saying coup?
No, I'm saying speak out. I'm saying, politicians actually listen not because they care, but because they want to get reelected. And so if the public demands things, they'll do it, not because they think it's right or they care about the well-being of the public necessarily, but because they want to get reelected.
So it's probably one of these things you don't want to be right, do you? When you go to the doomsday meeting, you're probably going, I hope I'm not right.
No, I hope that we are right about addressing what the biggest challenges are, so we can get people most concerned about those.
Very good. We're gonna go into the WTF segment real quick. I don't want to swear. Do you swear? We'll
Never.
say what
yeah,
the F.
Of course I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna say three different scenarios. What the F, and then whatever you think of real quick. And these are all things that have once come out of your mouth. Okay. What the F, Lawrence Krauss, comparing 4-year-olds to Donald Trump.
It's an insult to 4-year-olds.
What the F, Donald Trump, going on in Australia, people wanting to convert coal into energy.
It's it's selfishness, because the Australians seem to think that somehow their economy is going to continue as long as they play handmaiden to China. And China's smartening up, and Australia better realize that its future doesn't depend on coal. And the sooner they realize that, the better off they'll be. And in fact, the more children will live longer, because coal kills people.
And me being a recent visa holder, a recent permanent resident of Australia, which I'm very proud of, which took almost 4 years. What the F, Lawrence Krauss, Australia limiting visas for immigrants to come to the country? It's
just an example of the kind of myopia. Politicians build on fear, and if you can make people afraid of that immigrants are going to take their job or they're going to hurt them, then you can control people more. But in fact, for both the United States and for Australia, those countries depend on the immigrants that have already come and the talent that comes from outside. When you close your borders to the most talented young people in the world, you're pretty well assured that your country is going to go downhill.
It's almost like Australia is just kind of playing backseat and just doing what they're supposed to do, and it's frustrating.
I think the United States is driving them to the right, and because as long as they're not as crazy as Donald Trump, then people say, well, you're not as crazy. But keeping out immigrants in many ways is bad. But talented immigrants, which is 457 Laws is doing, is just ridiculous. It means, for example, I was talking to my friend Brian Schmidt, who's a professor here and won a Nobel Prize in physics as an Australian now. And he wouldn't have been allowed in the country if the 457. He wouldn't have been allowed to become a tenured professor because he would have only been allowed to be here for a few years. It's ridiculous.
It's crazy that we draw these imaginary lines on a planet that nobody owns. That's the craziest bit.
Yeah, I know. I don't understand it.
How do we get there?
It's just crazy.
So I got a couple questions. We'll call them fan questions, but they're two people that mean a lot to me. One is a professor of physics and science, Van Woods. She's a lovely lady. It's her 70th birthday. By the way, happy birthday to you in 2 days, too.
Thank you.
Fan's question is, Mars One versus Elon Musk. What's your opinion on the idea of colonizing Mars versus solely exploring it?
Well, I think Elon's a friend of mine, and I think these notions about Mars are largely crazy. I think there's no urgency to colonize Mars. I think it's also unrealistic in the near term. In the long term, it's fine, but Elon's not going to send a lot of people to Mars, no matter what he thinks. It's dangerous. People die. Space. Humans evolved on Earth, and are not well suited to space. And Mars is not a friendly environment. Moreover, it just costs so much damn money to get people to Mars, and keep them alive. Certainly, a round trip is ridiculous because it just it costs so much. 99.99% of the dollars is spent on keeping people alive. And as I often like to say, you can send a rover to Mars to explore it, an unmanned rover to Mars, for about the same cost as it takes to make a movie about sending Bruce Willis to Mars.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Last one, Max Woods, who's also a teacher, who's also a former immigrant from the U.S., going on, I think he's 69, he'll yell at me for that. He says, where does consciousness enter into your quest for understanding?
Well, it doesn't enter much at all. I do physics because it's easy. And consciousness is a concept that's so complicated we don't even understand it. So I think we will someday, but it's a long haul. And so I have no pretense of understanding the nature of consciousness. The brain is very complicated. So I just take the low-hanging fruit, which is the universe.
Be sure to grab Lawrence's new book, The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far, and follow him on Instagram at Lawrence.Krauss, Twitter at lkrauss1, Facebook at LawrenceM.Krauss. Did I forget anything? Do you want to add anything to this?
No, this has been fun. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Lawrence Krauss. I really
Thank you.
appreciate you for sharing the space with me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, guys.
Good. That was fun. Good
Thanks.
luck to you.
I appreciate you.
That was
Yeah, that was awesome.
good. That was great.